Welcome to the latest in the series of AHDB Pork webinars. I'm Sue Ravitch from the Environment and Buildings team here at AHDB Pork, and I'm very pleased to welcome veterinary surgeon Nigel Woolfenden, partner at Bishopton Veterinary Group, who is going to talk to us about correcting farm water supply. It's an important topic and one we'll be talking about, I think, for some time to come. This session is primarily aimed at vets and others who advise producers, but anyone else who's listening is very welcome.
Hello everybody, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Nigel Woolfenden. I'm a veterinary surgeon who's specialised in commercial pig production over the last 20 years, with a particular interest in the efficiency of production and disease control without reliance on antibiotic use. I'm now also one of the research team at RAFT Solutions, and we've worked in collaboration with Jamie Robertson of Livestock Management Systems, Hugh Crabtree of Farmex, and the AHDB Pork team on their water project, which has been running now for around about 8 months. Water is one of the absolute basic needs of the pig, and 20 years ago a lot of emphasis was placed on ensuring pigs received sufficient good quality water. But during the course of the project, it's become apparent that perhaps the emphasis has changed a little bit with other priorities such as nutrition and genetics, and water may have become something that we take for granted these days in an area where we could actually make some productivity gains if we do get it right. I think AHDB Pork should actually be commended for raising the profile of water in pig production with another generation of pig farms. As I say, the water project is actually very wide-ranging, and it covers production, health, environment and medicine aspects, with the particular driver being the need for the UK pig industry to be seen to be using antimicrobials in a focused and responsible manner, and water-soluble administration obviously offering considerable opportunities in these areas. RAFT have been responsible within the water project for a desktop literature review, and we've contributed to a farmer-facing report that will be completed in March. But it was felt that some of the early findings should be communicated as soon as possible, and hence we have our webinar tonight. We'll be aiming to cover within this the following topics, which hopefully you can see on your screen there. We will take questions during the event and answer them at the end, as Sue's already said. First of all, if we start with the actual initial source of where most pigs in the UK actually get their supply from, it used to be that many years ago we actually, most of our pig supply actually came from the mains, and the public water supply does actually have a certain minimum quality governed by quite stringent water regulations, and that ensures a standard of human potability of water. So at least usually as it entered the pig unit boundary, it was of a very suitable quality with no health implications. And those standards actually covered both mineral and microbiological content. In contrast now, many pig units actually have either a sole private supply or an additional private water supply, mostly coming from borehole these days. And that's one of the major changes that I've seen in the last few years, is that principally on cost grounds alone, a lot of people have sunk their own boreholes, and they are now at least supplying some of the water provided to the pigs, although people do tend to keep a possible emergency connection to the mains for obviously any problems with the borehole. There's no real issues as far as any actual governing bodies are concerned about borehole supply. The Food Standards Agency actually considers farmers as primary food producers, and they will actually allow pigs to receive clean water as opposed to human potable water. It's a subtle difference, but what that means is that clean water is one that doesn't contain microorganisms or harmful substances which are capable of affecting the healthy quality of food, so in this case obviously pigs. But it doesn't, rather helpfully, the Food Standards Agency don't actually define what the fixed levels of what is adequate. The recent Red Tractor review has indicated that probably within 2017 the assurance standards will address this issue through a requirement to demonstrate testing of borehole or private supply to show that it's acceptable to livestock. But again, at the moment, there isn't strictly a definition of what is acceptable to livestock, although they've anticipated that a microbiological test for the total viable count of bacteria is required, and the absence of coliform bacteria. Irrespective of what our primary source is, the water flows on through pig farms in a multitude of ways. I've experienced a lot of farms, and I've never yet seen two that are the same in terms of their water supply. Invariably, there is a primary storage on farm, which is actually there to cope with a buffering supply. The reason being that any supply coming in is unable to cope with the variance of need that occurs through the day on pig units, where much of the demand is during the day, meaning that the primary supply is sort of topped up during the night with the borehole giving a constant rate. Invariably then it is either pumped or sent by gravity to some form of secondary storage, often within each building, either known as a header tank or a secondary tank, which again copes with the differences in supply before it is travelled through and goes to the end user, the consumer, which is the pig. Boreholes actually do require some control in that as far as the water standards for private supply go, then there is a best practice required under the Private Water Supply Regulations 2009, and they actually state boreholes should be protected from contamination. By that they mean access by insects or by rodents. They ask that manures or slurries shouldn't be applied within 50 metres of a borehole, or that again a borehole shouldn't be within 50 metres of a soakaway near contaminated areas, particularly such as lagoons and the like. And that makes obviously a lot of sense in terms of potential slurry or fertiliser contamination of the actual aquifers that the borehole is drawing from. In particularly porous areas, they request that such as limestone, sandstone, they request that further protection is necessary by either lining or sealing of the borehole, principally to protect against microbial contamination. And in the majority of cases that is being followed throughout the industry, although there have been a few instances, particularly where, for instance, flooding has affected us, as in 2 years ago, where unfortunately some contamination may have actually occurred. What should we actually do in terms of the ground source water? It basically normally contains the mineral levels of the aquifer that it's supplied from. So it's relatively constant if it's a deep well, but if it's a shallow well, or there's again possibility of permeation through sand or gravel, then that can actually alter through the year depending on rainfall and other situations such as flooding. So the general recommendation that we've actually likely to pass out to the industry is that it's probably a good idea once a week to actually just check generally for abnormal smell, taint, colour, which would probably happen anyway. But at first drill, we are suggesting that a full screen should occur for dissolved minerals and for microbiology. And usually the maintainer of whoever runs the borehole would actually repeat that annually on the producer's behalf. So that's actually at source, and that gives a general indication, as say, of the mineral level as it would be turning up on the farm, and it should be taken probably as read that the main supply should also be of a suitable standard, and that is being governed by the public water supplier. After that, water will come either out of the borehole and then will actually be treated depending on the quality of where it appears. It will go into settlement tanks sometimes in order to remove organic sediments, iron, manganese, which are actually they are soluble compounds which are, when they meet air and are oxygenated, they actually become insoluble. So you end up with a situation where sediments suddenly form, iron oxide, manganese oxide, and these will actually then be able to settle out within various settlement tanks, which is a very cheap and simple way of actually removing issues to begin with. And then depending on the quality of the borehole, initially filtration will occur, and other treatments such as ion exchange, if in particularly hard water. UV treatment is commonly added in order to try and remove some bacterial contamination. And these days it's increasingly likely that chlorination or other chemical dosing, perhaps peroxidation, might actually occur. So some examples here of our primary storage tanks of different vintages. It would be common to have, in some cases, mild steel or galvanized tanks, which, depending on their age, may then actually be prone to rusting themselves, further adding to contamination. Or more modern plastic construction can also be seen, which obviously are easier to clean. Usually after the borehole, the same mineral content doesn't change very often thereafter, but one thing we are finding that within the passage through the various storage systems and pipelines on the farm, the microbiological content, as in the bacterial level, is certainly varying widely thereafter that. Some photographs here of a relatively modern setup, which was implemented within the last 10 years. The top left-hand picture here shows it doesn't really help, I'm afraid, that all the water treatment tanks are the same colour. They seem to buy a job lot of containers. So the end two on here are actually filtration systems, whereas the middle two are actually chlorination tanks, where in this case a dairy chemical hypochlorite is used to chlorinate water after it's been filtered through the first two tanks. It then passes out to the bulk storage tank, comes back in through a filter, which again deals with any sediment which may have settled within that primary tank. And I have experience of those primary tanks over a period of time actually also becoming contaminated despite the filtration that's actually happening out there. And even these primary filters can be a source of microbiological contamination if not regularly changed. After that, as I say, later it could pass through some form of either peroxidation or a chlorination type system, which will aim to really reduce the possible bacterial contamination that may exist on the farm. It will then pass through to secondary storage in various buildings. Again, they serve to buffer the supply to the pigs within that building to ensure that there is sufficient resource available at all times for the pigs. They act as a backup reserve, but again they vary in sizes and they vary actually in the degree of sealing that they have, as in some of them have a push-on cover, some have a wooden cover, some have no cover at all, and again you can certainly get ingress into those of pig dusts, rodents and other contamination. Finally then delivered to a variety of sources of ways that the pig can access water. So we have drinkers of all shapes, sizes and degrees of cleanliness, I'm afraid, as well, from outdoor open troughs to indoor nipple systems, and again some degree of each one has its pluses and minuses in terms of how it would actually supply the water that the pig needs. An important factor to consider, certainly for vets and anybody else who needs to work out what pigs are actually drinking in terms of quantity, is to have a rule of thumb as to what's actually needed. Obviously, it depends. How much a pig needs to drink depends on a number of factors: the age, the size of the animal, as well as its state of production. A lactating sow obviously needing rather more than a pregnant sow to allow for the milk that she is producing. Dry feed versus wet feed, obviously the amount that the pig is drinking independently of the wet feed will be affected by that. in general, the quantity of feed does actually tend to govern very much what the pig is requiring to drink. So on dry feed, a pig is usually taking about 2.5 times the amount of water for every kilogram of dry feed that it needs, which is the equivalent of about 70 mils per kilogram body weight. Slightly more towards the younger end of the pig when the body mass of water is higher, and slightly less as the pig ages. Ambient temperature obviously has an effect on the water requirements of the pig, depending on whether the pig is within its thermoneutral zone. So, for instance, once a pig actually starts to exceed its comfortable temperature, there is more activity around water, and probably more water is actually wasted, but appetite may actually go down as the pig actually becomes too hot. So from that point of view, you may find that although water usage goes up, actually water consumption is lessened. And pigs certainly show a preference for drinking in hot conditions. They prefer to drink water which is colder, just like we would do. All pigs actually prefer clean and palatable water, and they will drink more of it. And I think this is an excellent picture taken by Angela Cliff that actually shows that the lengths that pigs will go to in order to try and find clean water rather than something which is soil contaminated. If we supply water, pigs will not overdrink. There is sometimes a farmer belief that say a good supply of water actually will encourage them to overdrink, but that's not the case. And certainly, if insufficient water flow or the quality of water provided is not good enough, what will happen is that because of the very close association between eating and drinking in all pigs, that you will actually find that the pig will actually undereat if it's not given enough water. And in the days when we are all driving our genetics in order to give a very high appetite pig, which is fast growing, it seems an obvious deficiency to kill that appetite by not giving it sufficient water of the correct quality. A sow is normally spending about 15 minutes at a time at each drink. Basically, that seems to relate to the amount that she can get down before her stomach actually feels probably full. And that's a pregnant animal drinking approximately 2.5 to 3% of her body weight per day, with most of that in sows actually occurring around the time of eating. With finishing pigs, the same association between eating and drinking is also present. So growing pigs, for instance, will spend around about 30 days drinking water, with most of that actually occurring within 10 minutes of eating. Pigs on ad lib available food actually eat preferentially during the daytime. So, for instance, they commence eating usually around about the time of dawn, eat reasonably up until the point of mid-morning, then have a slight pause, and then certainly do the maximum amount of intake through the middle of the afternoon. Very little consumption of food actually happening during the hours of darkness, say, all things being equal within a group of pigs. With the association between eating and drinking, this means that actually all of the drinking should follow the similar pattern. And the graph to the right here is some data compounded from the barn report from FarmX over a number of farms of finisher farms, which actually does show, we call it a diurnal pattern. It means it's actually got two peaks within the day, one during the earlier middle of the morning, and then let's say the known peak which actually occurs in the afternoon. The bottom graph here is showing it actually the same pattern is repeated over 3 days, give or take, and that's actually quite a good indicator of the normal healthy behavior of a pig. So changes within that pattern can be used to indicate, for instance, that the pig is either too hot, in which case its feed consumption and its water patterns will change, or if there have been interruptions in water supply during the day, you will find that perhaps that feeding and drinking behaviour may spread into the night time, which is an indication of a pig which is not behaving normally. This creates, as you'll as we'll be aware, that actually during certain times of the day there is actually going to be a peak of demand, and that means that in the middle of the afternoon, with all the pigs, say in a finishing house, actually up on their feet and eating, there will be a big requirement for water during that time of day, and hence why we have to have some reserve within buildings. And if that reserve actually is exhausted, as can sometimes happen in summer, in the peak of demand, then we can risk actually cutting down flow to pigs at a critical time, which means they will not eat. In some cases, I have experienced problems with actually inconsistency of water supplies and flows, which have certainly caused some issues in terms of either vice or health within groups. And it's been reported throughout the literature that you will actually see increased aggression, for instance, anytime that there is competition for the resource, which is water supply. So drinkers blocked or issues with water supply, and you will certainly get tail biting as a vice being demonstrated. Chronic long-term shortages of water flow will lead to particularly pregnant animals perhaps drinking insufficiently, which can manifest as cystitis, vulval discharges, and even ascending kidney infections. And shortages within lactating animals, which again is quite possible on group, where animals actually in a farrowing house, for instance, are all fed at similar times and the peak demand is high. If the plumbing system is unable to cope with providing it simultaneously to animals, some of those animals will lose out on water intake, lower their feed intake, and ultimately result in lowered weaning weights of complete litters if we are not able to supply needs fully. Within a group, if there is the situation where, for instance, flow rates are lowered, you will actually tend to get increased competition around drinkers. And the dominant pigs within the group, normally the larger ones, will tend to have preferential access. You will not see it always as aggression around drinkers. The less dominant pigs will actually step back and stay away from the feeders and will stay away from the drinkers. So from that point of view, I'm afraid the bigger get bigger and the smaller don't eat as often. So you get uneven growth within groups, which ultimately means that the average growth rate and food conversion efficiency of the groups is affected. If water supply is not seen to properly, say, within groups, and pigs end up from that point of view not eating, or there is stress levels involved in competition for water. Certainly gastric ulceration can be one evidence which is seen. Very little to see from the outside of the pig, but sometimes a higher incidence of sudden mortality, with pigs presenting as being very pale at death, indicating that perhaps they've bled from a bleeding gastric ulcer. And yeah, even in wet-fed pigs, inconsistent water supply, particularly during the heat of summer, pigs will become thirsty, and they are sometimes then actually drinking the liquid liquor on top of wet feed to assuage their thirst, and that in turn can lead to wash through the stomach, different fermentation within the small intestine, and whey bloat or torsion of the intestines actually developing. So water, very big impact on the physical performance of a number of pigs for that reason, and that is purely in terms of quantity rather than actual quality. Causes of this poor flow, as I have already mentioned, we might not have enough volume reserve, we might have the wrong pipe sizes and layout. In some cases, pig units have changed over the years, new buildings have been put up, old buildings have been taken out of production, and in some cases we just haven't got the correct flows around the units that we expected. Other times the drinker setup has been incorrect. For instance, at the back of nipples, for instance, there is a filter which is there to take out any organic matter, and also behind the nipple there is a restrictor which is set in order to prevent excessive flow which in itself can be a cause of wastage of water. So under high pressure systems, the restrictor is there in order to be able to limit the flow to that the pig can comfortably swallow. If these restrictors have become blocked for whatever reason, or the filters are damaged, or alternatively nipples themselves have actually corroded, then we can end up with incorrect flows in certain areas of buildings. If we come to the actual quality of water, we have actually looked at what could be required. My clients will often say to me, I'd like to test my water. And the question really here is, what are we actually talking about in terms of quality? There are three major contaminants, which are the physical contaminants of silt and organic matter, which could be taken out, if you like, by a filter. We also have the mineral contamination, which will be there by dissolved solutes within water. And then there is the microbiological contamination, which would also can occur within water. So we have, again, looking through the scientific literature, it's actually a little bit surprising how small the actual true evidence base is. If, for instance, compared to feed ingredients, where there are always controlled trials and small variations within key ingredients in order to measure the effect, within, say, the arena of water, very little has actually been controlled in terms of true clinical trials. More is known about the effects of mineral contamination, principally because certain areas of the US, where they are very dependent on boreholes, have measured feeding clean water, if you like, along with their mineral contaminated water, and been able to produce some comparative results. But very little actually there in terms of absolute microbiological levels, and we've attempted to try and address this in some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months to see where we may need to be in terms of microbiology. Certainly within it there will be no cut-off values which are actually demonstrably black and white. I'm afraid even different areas of the world differ in their mineral levels as to what they might actually accept as being suitable. And I think actually probably the correct approach here might actually be to actually look at the risks throughout a farm of where minerals and microbiological contamination might cause problems. And based on that, to actually do some measurements within the farm and aim to reduce them once they start to get up to levels which are obviously affecting pig production. Very often the first place that someone would start would be to actually with their borehole sample and to actually look at the analysis of minerals. Within that, some important factors that we might want to consider as vets and others who are looking at the effect not only of water on the pig but also on the infrastructure of the farm might actually want to consider, for instance, the pH of the water, which, as we all would probably know, is the acidity level. And this would indicate usually that there are some form of dissolved salts, bicarbonate, likely to make it more alkaline. And this is important actually for its effects on the solubility of pharmaceutical products, with a number of them being quite hard to dissolve in water of the extremes of pH, and also for its effects on chlorine. For instance, chlorination actually not working very well in alkali water, which a number of the boreholes that we've looked at have actually been certainly towards the alkali end of the pH spectrum. Other minerals that we might want to look at would include calcium and magnesium, because they are the main contributors to the hardness of water, which hardness obviously leading to limescale, scale formation both within pipes and start to affect equipment such as pressure washers, drinkers, and dosers that we might use for administering medicines. Hard water also it changes the effectiveness of some detergents and disinfectants, and the pH is certainly something that every farmer should be aware of before they choose which detergents and disinfectants will be most effective on their farm. In terms of actual pig health, pigs, as we know, are very adaptable and very tolerant creatures in the main, and from that point of view, they appear very tolerant actually of hard water in terms of production effects. Nitrate and the linked nitrate levels are important in a number of species, not least of which ruminants, because nitrate can be converted in the rumen to a more toxic nitrite. Nitrates can be an indicator of, say, potential fertilizer contamination, but there are some areas of the country, particularly Derbyshire, for instance, that are show a very high natural level of nitrate. Pigs are exceptionally resistant to any toxic effects of nitrate, and certainly with anything that's likely to be found within drinking water, there are unlikely to be any health effects. And the main problem there may well be that if we take a high nitrate water and expose it to light, we may well stimulate growth of algae within our systems. Sodium can be found within drinking water. Obviously, the sodium chloride level would be indicators of the saltiness of water, and high salt levels make it unpalatable to pigs, and so will reduce their intake. And for instance, some boreholes around the coast may actually be picking up brackish water, which could be having some production effects. Sulfate actually is a very interesting and probably quite pertinent compound within pigs, in that actually they're found as a natural component of certain soil types, and if they are present soluble within the water source, occasionally you will actually pick them up by the smell of bad eggs that are given off as bacteria work on them and break them down to hydrogen sulfide. Calcium and magnesium salts of sulfate are actually laxative. They are actually the Epsom salts of this world, which what they will do within pigs is pigs are very good at absorbing the sulfate within the small intestine, but then actually get rid of it by excreting it out into the large bowel. And high levels of sulfate within the large bowel will draw water out with them and end up producing a degree of looseness to diarrhea within pigs. With time, 2 to 3 weeks, the pig will actually adapt and will its looseness will actually resolve. But that is certainly a sudden exposure of pigs from a low sulfate water to a high sulfate water, or even from a low sulfate liquid such as milk to a high sulfate water at weaning, may actually result in diarrhea, which doesn't actually seem to cause a great deal of production effect on the pig in terms of growth rate, because it's actually occurring in the large bowel after most of the small intestine has done its work. But it can be quite a dramatic diarrhea, and well recognized in America as a cause of looseness. And I'll come on to later how some of the findings may actually indicate that this is also the case in certain areas of the UK. Iron and manganese I've already mentioned, because the soluble salts of each become insoluble and precipitate out as they hit fresh air. And when they do that, you will actually see iron showing a rusty red orange precipitate, and manganese actually a blackish precipitate. And they are important because waters high in these levels will actually add to the solidification of biofilm. Again, something I'll mention later. Iron is also important. It will support the growth of coliform bacteria at lower levels, and at higher levels will actually reduce the intake of water. And iron is certainly associated with more of a tendency towards scour, particularly again in newly weaned pigs. This is a water tank showing water flowing in, hitting the air, and with a red deposit. This is a misting system on a more modern unit where the borehole water has been used for soaking down, and you can actually see a lovely, almost chromatogram of here iron and manganese and limescale actually being developed on the wall, and that's actually nearly impossible to disinfect once it gets to that sort of level of contamination. And the top photograph there is actually a MDPE alkathene blue pipe with molybdenum deposits there, where biofilm has formed, and molybdenum has been taken out of the water by the biofilm bacteria, and you have a deposition occurring. Iron particularly important in terms of the speed it can build up, and it can block the filters at entrance to the farm and throughout the farm, reducing flow rate, and in that case can actually produce complete water shortages, which, as I say, will risk outbreaks of vice or other stress-related disease. And these filters, which are high in iron, and can be certainly a potent source of microbiological contamination. And as that water flows through pipes, then you will get calcified or biofilm or ferrous biofilm forming throughout the systems, and they will be throughout systems. So attempting to spot treat, sort of in areas where it's recognised, for instance, first stage weaners or in farrowing houses, is going to give disappointing results, because it will very quickly reform, and effectively the contamination has to be taken out at source. So as part of the project, we actually looked at what was possibly available in terms of the boreholes that are being used on pig units through the UK. It was quite hard in order to actually find independent information on this. We're very grateful to a collaborator at NRM Laboratories who allowed us to search their database for borehole samples. We don't know whether these are actually in use or have been used on pig units, but they were throughout the UK, so they give an indication of where the variations exist. So, for instance, a pH here which has certainly been as high as 8.4 in terms of alkalinity of the water. And just picking out the highlights here, most of the boreholes that we looked at were actually quite suitable for pigs, but as you see here, we actually have upwards of 16% of boreholes that may be throwing a high sulfate water out into the pigs who are drinking that water, with the effects that I've described earlier. In terms of microbiology, where do we actually sit with some of the samples that we've looked at throughout farms? The Drinking Water Inspectorate, as I say, has defined standards for microbiology, which obviously are human potable standards. As far as pigs are concerned, these probably are higher than we would need in terms of any sort of form of health effect whatsoever. A DEFRA study in 2003 actually went through and sampled various 4 places within upwards of over 30 farms, and they actually found that in those various areas that based on a total bacterial count within the drinking water of over 2,000, that actually quite a high proportion of those farms were showing some degree of contamination at that point, really without any evidence really of obvious clinical issues at that time in terms of production or in terms of actual disease. We have taken samples on a number of our farms over the years, and also analysed that. And within where we actually suspected clinical issues on the farm, which I'll come to later as to what those clinical issues were, we actually found that in terms of this is a TVC, a total viable count of bacteria measured at 2 different temperatures, and then also examined for the presence of coliforms, which usually are fecal associated organisms, and then the final analysis done is looking for E. coli, known as a pathogen within pigs and other species. And as you see, there's appreciable range here in terms of bacterial contamination, getting up to 650,000 on one of our clients' farms at one point. So based on using our interpretation of pig acceptable water, we actually found we have analysed this and found that approximately half of the samples at any one time were contributing potentially to clinical issues within pigs. What were we actually looking for when we got to this point? We found that a high microbiological load might actually affect a number of issues. Pre and post weaning diarrhea perhaps being some of those that could be expected in terms of weaner pigs drinking large amounts of bacteria in the water, but also pigs not showing diarrhea but just fading as a result of damage to the small intestine and possibly just overload in terms of bacteria. We found elevated non-specific mortality rates, and within the sort of adult sort of sections, we've actually found the high coliform levels and high levels of lipopolysaccharide, which are one of the cell walls of coliform bacteria. They act as a stimulator to the immune system. They affect appetite. If you exposed to a lot of lipopolysaccharide from the bacterial cell wall, appetite is certainly affected, which creates poor growth. It will actually even produce pyrexia, temperatures, and that in the past has been associated with increased levels of returns and even spontaneous abortion. It can hardly be great to have a high microbiological load when we're talking about trying to make our disinfectants as effective as possible, and bearing in mind that no antibiotic will be effective against all bacteria, even dead bacteria creating some degree of challenge to the pig. Perhaps response to antibiotics has not been as effective as we would want it to be. So if we suspect any of these problems, how should we actually sample for bacteriology? Whilst there are a number of laboratory standards for actually testing for bacteria, there's nothing in terms of sampling, and it really just means that we have to be sensible in terms of hygienic precautions. I would suggest that there's no point taking it from grossly contaminated sites if we're actually looking particularly for coliforms, and we should be careful we don't contaminate when filling containers. We must use a sterile container which will contain a chlorine neutralizer in it, usually already within the sampling pot, in order to avoid death of bacteria whilst it's being transported to the lab, and at the same time we would actually chill these samples and make sure they're tested quite promptly. And the point is actually the water here should be representative of what the pigs actually drink, whilst avoiding contamination. So for instance, it might mean that we actually let a nipple drinker run for a period of time, but not an excessive period of time, that we're not pulling it from the line that the pig would actually be drinking itself. So it seems little point actually to be taking it from a trough which is contaminated as the one at the bottom right, because invariably that's probably not indicative of the water that's being delivered into the trough, and we should be looking perhaps, if pigs are within the pen, perhaps breaking the line and taking it from a suitable area, but bearing in mind that the various filters and restrictors that might be present within a nipple are the ideal breeding grounds for bacteria. So where's this microbiological contamination actually coming from? A high microbiological load will possibly come in at source if it's a borehole supply and it is contaminated. One reason that we check the supply on a regular basis. But a lot of it is likely to come whilst it's actually passing through contaminated areas of the farm. For instance, primary storage, as we talked about, might have quite a lot of sludge built up over the years. Pipes through elderly units could equally be contaminated with biofilm, which I'll come on to later, and any open phase of water that might exist within header tanks, for instance, will invariably have some contamination. Biofilm is inevitable. It will develop. It's where bacteria will develop any point between a solid face and a liquid face. So examples of it would be the plaque on our teeth, or the slime which develops on rocks at the seaside. Biology will hang on to anywhere it possibly can, and even within smooth water pipes there will be initially the attachment of bacteria to the surface, and these will proliferate. This is an example looking down the inside of, again, a blue alkathene type pipe, typical of being found on a number of units. Initially adhesion and growth, proliferation of bacteria, which starts to then become confluent, and at this point, depending on what the water is that's going past the bacteria, they will absorb mineral content and possibly become solidified. And they then form a very, very complex biological system, including algae, fungi, multiple bacterial species, which all exist within harmony and a state of symbiosis, and they will develop to quite a depth. And whilst they are present within that, bacteria are actually protected from the chemicals which might be present within the water. So attempts at sanitization, antibiotics, for instance, will not penetrate down to the very deeper layers of that biofilm. So where is it most likely to actually occur? We have a situation where, for instance, if you have a high nutrient water with a lot of organic components within it, biofilm will develop faster. If the water is slow moving, for instance, there's greater chance of attachment, and again, faster development of biofilm. A rough surface will enable faster attachment. So for instance, a smooth stainless steel pipe will be inhibitory to biofilm, whereas a rougher galvanized type surface will allow faster development. And as they are dependent on bacterial proliferation, actually the ambient temperature where the water is held will certainly influence the development of biofilm. The highest rate is going to be observed between about 15 to 25 degrees. So for instance, still or slower moving water in warmer temperatures is going to happen in the areas of farm, for instance, like a farrowing house, or certainly the first few weeks where a flat deck area might be occupied by pigs not drinking very much in that instance. Pigs will directly inoculate it at drinker points, and certainly within trough and river drinkers, and we'll get indirect inoculation into wherever there is a break in the pipe. Say those open faces of water sitting within buildings will be inoculated by dust, some dried feces, and also skin scale arising from the pigs. So we have a situation, for instance, the pig is drinking, very close association of the mouth with the drinker. We know, for instance, a lot of pathogens now can be found in saliva. We will find PERS virus, and we're even testing for it now through saliva. They will move into those complex areas behind the actual nipple, where the filter might be, where the restrictor might be, and then ultimately establish themselves into the pipeline system. So multiple routes, for instance, being delivered into header tanks, contamination into header tanks from the air and aerosol, and then direct inoculation. Is this important? Well, the biofilm will both, a number of pathogens are able to then join the biofilm within water pipes. So for instance, there's a number of common pathogens there, and in most cases their survival rate is usually beyond the period that, for instance, a room or a drinking system might be left empty between the batches of pigs that move into any one particular room. So the water system can be a definite place where infection will persist from one batch of pigs or one occupation to the next one. And farmers spend a lot of time and huge amounts of effort trying to clean the physical surfaces of rooms in order to remove pathogens and bacterial contamination, and yet we could actually have very large numbers of pathogen survival occurring within the water systems. And obviously it would be sensible to remove that, and also to remove the biofilm that's protecting the pathogens. In order to deal with the pathogens, we're actually finding that awareness of biofilm has increased certainly in the last two to 3 years. A lot of people are using various water sanitizers. As well, to bear in mind that actually some of these sanitizers are actually going to not be compatible with the medications that we're actually administering as veterinary surgeons, and we must consider that, particularly if they're modifying pH or they're oxygenating compounds. We should remember that the actual sanitization might be being administered remote from where we are viewing the pigs. So, for instance, the situation on the left here is where chlorine is being added at the borehole end and running through the pipes, and it may not be considered that this is actually present when we are examining, for instance, 6 pigs further down the line. The pH of water is sometimes being modified in different places on the farm, with acidification post-weaning being again quite common these days in order to control enteric disorders. But adding certainly vaccines or antibiotics into these sort of sanitized systems must be done with care, and we must seek the advice of the product manufacturer to make sure that they are happy with it being administered under these conditions. The picture on the right hand side there is actually showing a medicine residue left some time after administration has actually occurred to the pigs. Remember that high mineral content will actually interfere with the activity of some of our antibiotics. For instance, high iron, high magnesium, calcium will all inactivate things like tetracyclines and colistin within the water that we are using to administer them. Bacteria within a biofilm will actually be up to 1,000 times less susceptible to antibiotics than free-living bacteria. So, for instance, they are some of our pathogens that have been introduced and are staying there. We are going to get much reduced effect that we would perhaps expect as the biofilm complexes our antibiotics, and less is available to get to the downstream pigs we're trying to treat. I would use the analogy here of we would not really expect a farmer to pick up a filthy syringe and then use it to inject medicines into a sick pig, and yet we might quite happily sort of condone the fact that a water system is filthy before we administer antibiotics through it, because just purely through a state of ignorance and us failing to actually have a look at that. We should also consider that if we do use antimicrobials and administer them through the water system, we have problems that potentially we may leave behind resistant bacteria within that biofilm. So a cleaning of the system before administering antibiotics, and then a cleaning of the system afterwards in order to avoid selection for antimicrobial resistance should be considered. The bottom right-hand picture here is actually of acid slime, which has built up within a system that has been used as a nutritional support post-weaning, say to control E. coli, but it will not stop the development of all biofilm, and here we have an acid-tolerant slime which has built up within that area. So rotation of water sanitizers is probably sensible to avoid any total biofilm buildup. I think actually at this point I'm just going to consider our key messages, as I am probably running out of time, but our key messages within this is that there are a number of unexplained health, production and vice issues that I've come across over the years, and would recommend that a lot of people look at water as being a component within those, and if in doubt, measure and test. Before we administer any water-soluble products in terms of veterinary medicines, we should look at the pH and the mineral content of the water that they're being added to. Whilst we are cleaning water to the benefit of pigs, we must also be aware of the impact they might have on medication stability. We are going to have to expect more in-water medication if in-feed medication is to be more limited, and therefore we really need a good infrastructure if we're going to deliver it effectively, prudently, correctly. And whilst we have such huge variation in microbiological content of water throughout pig systems, a sequential sampling and analysis to find out actually where this is occurring, and then a logical approach to cleaning it up would be hugely beneficial, I think, in terms of pig health on a number of units. So I'd just like to thank the many people who've actually assisted us during the project. I hope you will all look out for the final report in order to be able to study this at greater length. But we have had a huge amount of help from a lot of people here, and we are very grateful.